Thank you to everybody for joining. Tonight, we are continuing our shiur on tefillah, and we've approached the very end of tefillat shachrit. And in the olden days, and I mean real olden days, tefillah, what they would call tefillat hayotzer, or what we call tefillat shachrit, used to end with ubalat zion. Essentially, most people would do the Berchot HaShachar at home. They would do Pesukei de Zimra at home. They would come to shul for Baruch Hu, for Birchat HaYotzer, and then they would do Shmona Esrei. And then after that, there'd be sometimes Kriyat Torah, and then Asher Uval Tzion, and that was the end of Tefillah. That was the end of the official statutory liturgy. Yet in the time of the early Rishonim, we find additions, especially in the poskim and in manuscripts of Sidurim. We find many additions to the end of Tefillah, which eventually became more and more common and more obligatory, so to speak, as they became hallowed with the sanctity of time. Some famous ones are Pitum HaKetoret, or Ein Ke'Elokeinu, or the Shir Shel Yom, or Aleinu L'Shabeach. These are many parts of the Siddur which to this day remain optional. From a halachic perspective, many of these tefillot are optional. However, they became such a part and parcel of tefillat shachrit that they are printed in the Siddurim as a mandatory liturgy, as a part that we have to say. They're structured with a kaddish, and yet their history is not so simple. And as we saw last week with Ein Ke'Elokeinu, that might have been a very ancient prayer that came from the piyutim of the Sifrei Heichalot. And how exactly it got into the tefillah every day is very much a mystery. So tonight, I want to focus on Aleinu L'Shabeach. I want to use the topic of Aleinu L'Shabeach as a jumping board for understanding many of these other tefillot that were appended to the end of tefillat shacharit. So let's begin with the character of Aleinu in general. Let me share my screen with you. If you're familiar with the prayer, and I'm sure most of my listeners are, the tefillah of Aleinu L'Shabeach is one of the few rabbinic prayers that is not a bracha, it is not a benediction, and it is not characteristic of any of the early rabbinic prayers. It doesn't have in it Baruch Atah Hashem. It doesn't begin with Baruch Atah Hashem. It doesn't end with Baruch Atah Hashem. It doesn't begin with Yehi Ratzon. It doesn't end with Yehi Ratzon. It doesn't begin with Rachmana. It doesn't begin with Hamakom. Aleinu L'Shabeach is a pure and a pure tefillah of shvach from the time of the Rabbanim, and I'll use that term loosely because we're going to discover how difficult it is to date. But it is one of those really early prayers which defies the typical structure, typical character of the tefillot of the Chachamim. And the most its closest brethren would be a prayer like Nishmat Kol Chai, or a prayer like Al HaKol Yitzgadal or Kaddish, tefillot that are really early, that speak about Shevach of Hashem, but do not conform to the early style of. They do not conform to the early style of bracha or Yehi Ratzon or any of the early models of the Chachamim. Now, the earliest scholars of Jewish liturgy assumed that this entire prayer, Aleinu L'Shabeach, was originally written by the school of Rav. Rav, in case you didn't know, is one of the earliest Amoraim, if not the earliest. He's the Talmid of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. He's a Talmid of one of the last Tanaim. And Rav moved from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and there was a yeshiva in Bavel which was called Beirav, right, or Beit Rabbeinu Shebibavel. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, which is designed to incorporate Tekiyat Shofar, is a type of Musaf called a Tekiyata. And their Tekiyata that was popular was Tekiyata Devei Rav, and we still use it till today, the Tekiyata that was designed in the school of Rav. So the earlier scholars of Jewish liturgy assumed that Aleinu l'Shabeach was written by the school of Rav. It was the Chazanim or Rav himself, somebody who instituted from Aleinu l'Shabeach all the way to the end, Al Kei Nekaveh. And frankly, the evidence to this early date is obvious. Look at it with me together. Look at it on the screen. Aleinu l'Shabeach ladon hakol. That is four syllabic. The meter is four stresses. Aleinu. It falls four times. Aleinu l'Shabeach ladon hakol. Latet gidula v'yotzer bereshit. Right? It's falling four times, and there's two sticks to each stanza. Shelo asanu kigoye harasot, vilo samanu k'mishpachot hadama. This is very clearly early Jewish poetry. This is very clearly early liturgical poetry. This is what we've seen in the very earliest piyutim from the late medieval era and from late antiquity and early medieval era. To the eyes of the earliest scholars of Jewish liturgy, there was no question that this was one of the earliest piyutim that became part of statutory liturgy. This is one of the of Tefilat Chovah. This is one of the earliest piyutim that became a part of Tefilat Chovah, and it was written for the Malchiot section, the section of Musaf which talks about Hashem's Malchut on Rosh Hashanah. This was very obvious to them, and this was how they understood the Tefillah. There was a dissenting opinion, though. I think it was Kaufman Kohler in the Encyclopedia Judaica. No, I'm sure it was. He points out that it never mentions in the Aleinu l'Shabeach a specific reference to Mashiach. It never asks specifically for Mashiach, and it refers to Hashem as Melech. Malchei HaMelachim, Lifnei Melech Malchei HaMelachim Kadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem was the king of all kings, right? The king of all kings. So he looks at this and he says, similarly to Sunsan al-Bogan, but not directly attributing it to Rav. He says, if you think about this is probably a pre-Christian prayer. Think about it. In other words, Rav would have lived in a time when Christianity already existed. But if you think about this tefillah, if it was anti-Christian, because it's just Shalasan Ki Yeratzot, then it would specifically point out our vision of the Mashiach. And second of all, it was the Persian kings who used to call themselves Melech Melachim. The Persian kings were the ones who used to call themselves the kings of kings. So if this tefillah is a form of polemic, where it's saying we're not like the Goyim, who believe in their kings of kings, this is probably talking about the Persian era, which is also pre-Christian, meaning the pre-Christian Persian era of Eretz Yisrael, which honestly could be just before the time of the Tanaim. It's a very interesting thing to argue, but I'm not completely convinced by his arguments. I do like the idea of Malchei Malachim, but even Rav lived, as far as I know, in a Persian era. So you're also, at this point, you're reading a lot into very few words. We don't have that much information on in the Aleinu, right? We don't have that many words in Aleinu. So how can you read so deeply into so few words and paint an entire history with so few words? So time went on, and more work was done on Aleinu as the 20th century moved on. But I'm not going to go in chronological order I'm not going to go in the I'm not going to study the historiography directly chronologically. Let's instead study the next theory for when Aleinu was developed chronologically in the sense of world time, and that is the Hechalot literature. As we discussed last week, Ein Kelokeinu is one of those tefillot which appears in the Sifrei Hechalot, but so does Aleinu l'Shabeach. Aleinu l'Shabeach appears in a sefer of the Hechalot called Maaseh HaMerkava. As we discussed last week, the Sifrei Hechalot are a controversial collection of mystical books that date back probably to the time of the Tanaim. And some of them are genuine. Some of them seem to be genuine from the time of the Tanaim, and some of them are disputed. However, and there are, of course, interpolations which are added later. But let's look at this together. And this is brought by Meir Bar Ilan in his work on Tefillah and the Hechalot literature. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Kivan shitpalalti tatfila hazo, ra'iti 640,000 ribo malachei kavod, shomdin keneged kisei hakavod. After I uttered my prayer, I saw 640,000. 640,000, 10,000. So that would be 64 million angels, Shomdim Keneged Kisei Kavod, who were next to the God's holy throne, and Natati Shavach al Kol Verai, and I gave praise for all of my limbs. Alai l'shabeach la'adon hakol, right, in the singular instead of the plural. Lateit kedula le'yoser b'yeshit shlo asanu kirasot. And then it goes back to the plural. Shlo asanu kirasot lo somanu kimishochat adama. Then it goes back to the singular. Shlo samchal ki bahem v'gorali k'chol amonam. The rest of it is similar, as you know, but then it interrupts. Hu Elokeinu ve'ein od acher. Emet Malkeinu efeso decha. Hashem hu Elokim. Hashem hu Elokim. Hashem hu Elokim. Hu echad u'shmo echad. Hashem Elokeinu. Hashem echad. Hashem kel achum achanun erech bayim v'ches v'emet. Al kein chavalach Hashem Elokeinu lirot meher b'tferet uzecha v'chulu. Okay, that's absolutely fascinating that we have here in the Sifrei Halachot, Hechalot, which is possibly dated to the time of the Tanaim, a very, very similar tefillah to Aleinu l'Shabeach. So Meir Bar Ilan says that in his opinion, this is really an old piyut from the Sifrei Hechalot, which in turn found its way into the Rosh Hashanah davening. Meaning, if you look at the Rosh Hashanah davening, Aleinu doesn't really perfectly fit into the Malchiot because it's a shvach. It's not a direct hamlacha. It's not directly crowning Hashem. And if you look at the Tshuvot HaGeonim, if you look at the responsa from the Geonic era, the Geonim have a shelah, if a yachid, if an individual person is allowed to say Aleinu if he's davening Musaf Rosh Hashanah. What would be the shelah? Why can't an individual, why are people asking the Geonim this? Why wouldn't an individual be allowed to say Aleinu l'Shabeach inside Musaf Rosh Hashanah? What's the difference if you're davening b'yachid or b'tzibur? It must be, according to Professor Bar Ilan, it must be that Aleinu l'Shabeach was added to the Musaf Rosh Hashanah from the Hechalot literature. It was a piyut that was added to the Musaf Rosh Hashanah. It is not originally from it. We don't have any makar in Talmud that it was in the Tekiyata de Beirav, and it was only added later. So just like any other piyut, they were asking the Yonim, can we say this piyut inside Rosh Hashanah, inside the Musaf Rosh Hashanah if we don't have a tzibor? That is the opinion of Meir Bar Ilan. Now he also brings a raya from the grammar. He believes that because it goes from the singular to the plural, that shows you a diachronic development, and that would lend proof to his own argument. I don't really buy that. I don't see that as a very convincing argument. That switching from the singular to the plural shows that it developed into something more popular. That's just not something that I personally am convinced by. But as you go on, 20 years after that, 20 years after his assertion, there was an article published by Yakir Paz, and I'm forgetting his name, something bar something. There's a pair of scholars who I believe were specialized in antiquities who who argued on Meir Bar Ilan's assertion, and they said no. If you look at this tefillah of Aleinu l'Shabeach and you compare it to other tefillot in the Sifrei, in the Sfarim of the Hechalot, it's not very similar. It's not very mystical. It doesn't really speak about Hashem or the Kisei HaKavod in the ways that other tefillot in the Sfarim of the Hechalot speak about it. Rather, they have a completely different theory. They take the words in Aleinu l'Shabeach, Aleinu l'Shabeach Adon HaKol, right? Latei Tudla and Yotze Bereshit. They take these two descriptions of Hashem and they see these as very instructive. The terms to describe Hashem as Adon HaKol or to describe Hashem as Yotzer Bereshit is very rare in Tefillah. Even more so, it is rare to see those two different terms put together. So in their view, this is actually a polemical prayer that was written in the 2nd or 3rd century. It's a polemic. It's coming to argue against heretics, right? Rather, everyone is going to see that Hashem is one and only one. They see it as a prayer. Their theory is not like Bar Ilan, that it's from the Sifrei Echalot. Rather, this is a prayer from the 2nd or 3rd century, whose intention was to argue against the Binitarians. Binitarians is not really a singular group of people, but it's an anti-Binitarian prayer, meaning anyone who believed in a dual system of divinity, whether they were Christians or Ashtian or whatever, people who believed in a dual Godhead, this tefillah was coming against them, because in many of the early Greek texts, which referred to Christians who believed in a Binitarian system, it refers to Hashem in ways like Adon HaKol versus Yotzei Bereshit, meaning that there's two different Godheads. There is one who created all of creation. There's another Godhead who actually administers the world. So this tefillah is coming against those ta'anot, and it is asserting that Hashem is one and only one. Now, again, that's reading a whole lot into very few words. It really is. You only have 4 words to deal with, and you're reading very deeply into those 4 words. But they do bring one raya, which I think is extremely interesting. One proof which really will make you think. That proof is from the one other time that, and I'll share my screen to show it to you. There is one other time when Adon HaKol and Yotzei Bereshit is put together. And that is in the version of Modim of Rav Simai. Rabbi Simai is one of the Amoraim in Eretz Yisrael, and he had a version of Modim that was said that he would say while the Chazan was doing Chazarat HaShatz, right? Just like we have Modim D'Rabbanan. Look at the Modim D'Rabbanan of Rabbi Simai, of Rabbi Simai from Eretz Yisrael. This is in Talmud Yerushalmi. Modim anachnu lach, Adon kol biriot, Eloka hatushbachot, Sur olamim, Chai haolam, Yotzei Bereshit, Mechaye metim, Shachiyatanu, V'kimatanu, V'zchiyatanu, V'siyatanu, V'karvtanu, Lodot Shimcha, Baruch Ata Hashem, Kel HaHodaot. Now, Modim is the one tefillah that in the time of the Tanaim was known that people would abuse it and use it to say Modim twice. Haomrim Modim Modim mishatkin oto. This is a Mishnah that says whoever says Modim twice, you silence him. We don't know what this nusach was. Were people saying the whole prayer of Modim twice? Were people using some sort of funny liturgy, some sort of funny prayer that used the word Modim twice or said the entire thing twice? We don't know. But it's clear that Modim was a particularly abused bracha, where people would use it to talk about 2 separate Godheads. That's why the Mishnah has to say, you can't say Modim Modim twice. You can't say Modim twice. And here, in the Tefillah of Reb Simai, you see him use Adon Kol Haberiot and Yotzei Bereshit. So in their view, this is clear that anytime you use both terms, you're trying to affirm that both the Adon Kol HaBeriot and the Yotzei Bereshit are one and the same God. Very interesting approach to Aleinu L'Shabeach. Okay, we can't read personally. Again, I love the courage. I love the courage, and honestly, their contribution, just their knowledge of the text of antiquity and the reality of antiquity is in and of itself incredibly valuable. So the contribution is welcome. I am very not convinced from the paucity of words we have. We don't, it's just all we have is the tefillah. We don't. Yes, it seems polemic, but to use 4 words to date the entire tefillah and to give it a whole theological weight, to me, just is really, really difficult. So let's move on to the next theory, and that is that of Yosef Heinemann. Yosef Heinemann, I think this was in roughly the 60s, published his famous Sefer Tefillah B'Tukufat HaTanaim V'Amoraim. I'm sorry that I didn't have enough time to prepare enough slides this week, but bear with me. In his work, which is called the Tefillah B'Tukufat HaTanaim V'Amoraim, he famously develops the form critical method. This is a method for studying liturgy where you study the form of the prayer and you look at how it addresses God, how it addresses the congregation, what words are used, where it seems to be its intended use. And by analyzing that, you could understand in what social groups the tefillah was developed. And in his view, all tefillot from the time of the Chachamim were developed among separate social groups in different social contexts. And eventually, the best ones survived and became statutory prayers. Now, everybody agrees to this to some degree, but he believed it to the extreme. He has a class of prayers that he calls Tefillot Beit HaMidrash. Included in this class, this is a class of prayers where these were tefillot which would be said after a period of study in a study hall. And those prayers would include tefillot like Ubal Etzion, Kaddish, Al HaKol Yitgadal, and a few others that he brings from various sources. What all of these tefillot have in common is that they praise Hashem. They praise Hashem without using Shem Havaya. They speak of Hashem in the third person, right? They talk about Hashem in Lashon Nistar. And lastly, they speak about the Geula, and they speak about the future utopia, so to speak, or the future redemption. And Rav Yosef Heinemann saw in this Tefillah Aleinu L'Shabeach a direct parallel to a tefillah like Ala Kol Yitkadal, because it does all of these things. It doesn't refer to Hashem and Shem Havaya. It speaks of him in the third person. And of course, it speaks about the Geula. So in his view, this was a tefillah that was designed in order to finish off a seder of Kriyat HaTorah or Limud HaTorah. But he goes much further. He says this style of tefillah is so early. Give me 1 second to share my slide again. This style of tefillah is so early that he believes it comes from the Maamadot in the Beit HaMikdash, meaning, and we're going to discuss this in a second. Ooh, I have to actually show my page, but there was I have to pull up the actual Gemara. Meaning that after they would read the Kriyat Torah among the assemblies in the Beit HaMikdash, that is when they would say Aleinu L'Shabeach. How do I know this? Well, it doesn't speak about the Beit HaMikdash as having fallen, and it instructs people to kneel and bow, right? Aleinu instructs everyone to kneel and bow, and it doesn't assume that the Beit HaMikdash has fallen. If you look at the text, it sounds like the Beit HaMikdash is still standing. So therefore, it must be from the time of the Beit HaMikdash when the ritual of Maamadot was still standing, and the people would come to the temple and they would do a Kriyat Torah, and it must come from that era. And that's when Aleinu L'Shabeach was written. So before the fall of the Churban, that was his conjecture. Again, it's an assumption. I'm sure he admitted as much, but that's how far back it goes. Now, I want to take a pause based on that note and just review with everybody what the Seder HaMaamadot actually are. So this is a famous Mishnah in Ta'anit. I think it's Chaf Vav Amud Aleph, Perek Daled, right at the beginning. How do I share sorry, I'm trying to remember how to share my screen because my brain's not working. You can take the chair, yeah. Here we go. The Mishnah in Ta'anit says that the Nevi'im Harishonim, the early prophets like Moshe, David, Shmuel, the early prophets thought that it was really important that Klal Yisrael shouldn't have the korbanot only done by the Kohanim. The Kohanim should not be alone in Yerushalayim like a group of elitists, doing the shchita and all the korbanot with no participation from the rest of Klal Yisrael. In their wisdom, the Nevi'im made an institution where all of Klal Yisrael should be part of the service in the Beit HaMikdash. So their system was as follows. They divided Eretz Yisrael into 24 different groups, 24 different jurisdictions. According to the history of the Gemara, maybe originally Moshe Rabbeinu did 8, and then Shmuel or David did the next 16, and eventually it developed into 24. Whatever the history was. There are 24 groups, 24 different, teams. throughout Eretz Yisrael, irrespective of what Shevet you were in. And what would happen was that there would be a mishmar, a watch, and each 2 weeks of the year, another group would be in charge in the Beit HaMikdash. So essentially, you take 1/24 of Klal Yisrael, you split it between Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim, and the Kohanim and Leviim would go up to the Beit HaMikdash to do their service, and the Yisraelim, some of them would go with them, and they would go to sing and to participate in the tefillot by the Beit HaMikdash, and some of them would stay in the cities and perform liturgies in the city and kriyot Torah in the city. Now, what exactly did they do? It was a special kriyat Torah. They would do a shiur shel yom. They would do a kriyat Torah they would read the what do you call it? The Parashat Bereshit. Now, what's very interesting about this, and I don't want to go too far in a tangent, is that recently some very formidable scholars like Yosef Tabori and David Henshka have argued that the Seder HaMaamadot, this entire liturgical institution, was the precursor and possibly the inspiration for the real institutionalized statutory prayer that Rabbi Gamliel created in Yavna, and that it was in turn inspired by the Maamadot. But without going on that tangent for now, the Gemara says over here that the Seder HaMaamadot was as follows. V'Yisrael Shaboto Mishmar, Mitkanasin Ba'arein V'Korim B'Maaseh Bereshit, quoting the Mishnah. Menahani Mili, how do we know that they would read Maaseh Bereshit? Amar B'Yakov Barach, Amar B'Asi. Ilmale Maamadot L'Nitkaimu Shamayim V'Aretz. If it wasn't for the non-priestly watches, the heavens and earth would no longer be allowed to be able to stand. Shnei Amar, V'Yomar Hashem Elokim Bama Irashena. As Avram Avinu told Hashem, how will I know that I shall inherit it? Amar Avraham, Ribono Shalom, Shema Yisrael Chotin Lefenecha, Ato Selam Kidar Mabul Kidar Flaga. Avram Avinu argued to Hashem. He said, maybe Klal Yisrael is going to sin and you're going to wipe them out. Amar Le, he said to him, Lav, nope. Amar Lefanav, Ribono Shalom Hodeini B'Amar Irashena. Hashem, give me proof. How do I know I will inherit it and my grandchildren will not sin and lose the inheritance of Eretz Yisrael? Amar Le, he said to him, Make me the Brit Ben Avitarim. Rather, Hashem was actually alluding to the Korbanot of the Beit HaMikdash, that would keep Klal Yisrael to inherit the land. Amar Lefan Ribono Shel Olam, Tenach Bizman Shebeit HaMikdash Kayam, said Hashem, that's okay when the Beit HaMikdash is standing. Bizman in Beit HaMikdash Kayam Atei Aleim. What are we going to do when the Beit HaMikdash is not standing? How are we going to keep the world standing? Amar Lo Kivarti Kanti Lahem Seder Korbanot. I already enacted for them the order of the Korbanot. Bizman Shekorim Bahen Lefanai, as they read them instead of actually doing them. Ma'aleani Aleim Ki Likivum Lefanai V'ani Mochel Lahem Al Kol Avonotehem. If they would just read them, it's as if they performed them, as if they actually did the sacrifice, and I will forgive all of their sins. From this is the fascinating makar for us reading things like Pitum HaKetoret and for reading the Seder Korbanot and Nezu Mekoman in our Tefillah, and we've discussed this many times before. This is a beautiful Gemara. What does this have to do with Aleinu? What this has to do with Aleinu is that, first of all, as we just mentioned, Yosef Heinemann makes the conjecture that Aleinu was part of the early Maamadot, the early liturgies of the Maamadot. In other words, when there was a mishmar, they would have a group of Israelim doing the Maamadot, quote unquote, and Aleinu was part of their Maamadot. But there's yet a whole new history to it that begins 1,000 years later with Rabbi Eliyahu HaZaken. Rabbi Eliyahu HaZaken was one of the Balei Tosafot from France in the 11th century. Rabbi Eliyahu HaZaken was revered by the later Rishonim. He learned by Rabbeinu Gershom. He was a contemporary, I believe, of Rishon Bar Yitzchak. And according to legend, he married the sister, or perhaps the niece, of Rabbeinu Hai Gaon. There are all sorts of legends about Rabbi Eliyahu HaZaken. He was also the composer of a piyut known as Ege Chiki. I forgot the full name of it is. But he was the author of one of the most famous Azharot, a list of 613 mitzvot for Shavuot, which the Tosafot respected so highly that they would bring halachic proofs from the Azharot of Rabbi Eliyahu Hazaken. Rabbi Eliyahu Hazaken, being one of the earliest Rishonim of France, had an enormous influence over the Jews of France and the Jews of Germany later. He was one of the earliest poskim, one of the most respected poskim, and the legends about him are abounded. You could look at the book from Avram Grossman on the early sages of France, or you could look at Chaim Hirschman's, not Hirschman. Well, Chaim Sherman. I'm sorry, Chaim Sherman's a book on the sages of France and the poets of France, and both have extensive histories of Rabbi Eliyahu Hazaken. What concerns us tonight is that the earliest Ashkenazi machzorim and sidurim contain a section called Seder Hamaracha Rabbi Eliyahu Hazaken. Rabbi Eliyahu Hazaken invented, as far as we can tell, a full optional liturgy to be said every day after Shachrit, and he called it Seder Hamaracha. The Maracha is like the pyre, the order of service. So saying like Seder HaMaracha is like the order of the pyre, so to speak. And he invented this optional prayer section to be said after Shachrit. Today, 1,000 years later, the name Seder HaMaracha fell out of use, and it's called Seder HaMaamadot. This is what people call it today. But in the time of the Rishonim, it was called Seder HaMaracha. And pictured here in front of us is the Corpus Christi College manuscript, manuscript 133. This siddur, which you see open to Halach Ma'anya, is the earliest siddur that we have from Europe. I kid you not. This is the earliest manuscript siddur that we have from Europe. It's clearly from the late 1100s. The owner of this was an Arabic-speaking Jew who lived in England. And he writes at the end, at the end of the book, because he had extra paper, he has a list of people who owed him money. And because we know some of those people who, like, I think one of them died in 1202, we could be sure that this siddur was written in the 1100s. So this is one of the earliest siddurim that we have, full siddurim. And it's also the first, the earliest Haggadah Shel Pesach, technically speaking, that we have from Europe. So in this Corpus Christi College, this manuscript number 133, Yisrael Tashema noticed that at the end of the Seder Hamaracha of Rabbi Eliyahu Hazaken appeared Aleinu l'Shabeach. So let's describe the Seder Hamaracha. The Seder Hamaracha essentially has three main components. Number one, you recite the Maaseh Bereshis, right? You do, like, on Sunday, you do the first day. On Monday, you do the second day of Bereshis. On Tuesday, you do the third day of Bereshis, and so on. And it contains the shiur shel yom. And it will contain, lastly, psukim from the Nevi'im. Some of the versions of it will also have the Ha'azinu, which is divided into sevenfold, the way they did it in the Beit HaMikdash. But in the Corpus Christi manuscript, it goes further, and after the Seder HaMaracha, it has Aleinu l'Shabeach. So when Yisrael Tashema, who's a professor in Eretz Yisrael, very famous scholar, when he saw this, he got really excited. He said, I know how Aleinu l'Shabeach got into the daily tefillah. How did it get from tefillah Rosh Hashanah all the way to the end of Shachrit? It must be that it was part of the Seder HaMaracha of Rabbi Eliyahu Hazaken. And because people had no time, people started to say less and less of Seder HaMaracha. It was an optional prayer anyway. And the last part, which was Aleinu, stuck. And that became the most popular part. Now, 100 years after this manuscript, we find a lot of evidence from the time of the Rishonim to the existence of Aleinu at the end of davening, right? We have it in manuscript, we have it in Sidurim, we'll have it in the works of the Poskim, etc. But in his view, it started as a part of the Seder HaMaracha and eventually became the only part of Seder HaMaracha because nobody wanted to do the Maamadot at the end of davening. And they just said one part of it. But it's not that simple. 20 years after that, I mean, the first research was done by Orbach on the Seder HaMaracha, and then 20 years later by Tashema, and then 20 years later, I think Grossman did a short thing on it, and then Ophir Mintzmanar, I'm sorry if I'm butchering his name, a professor in Eretz Yisrael, took another look. And he said, if you look at all the manuscripts more closely, very few of them actually have Aleinu. The vast majority of the manuscripts have the following parts of the Seder Hamaracha, but very few of them have anything like Aleinu. It is only in this Corpus Christi manuscript that you find Aleinu L'Shabeach at the end of the Seder Hamaracha. The rest of them don't really have it. And for the most part, the Seder Hamaracha, besides its core three parts, has all sorts of different parts that change. Like different manuscripts just developed it differently. There's a gradual development and evolution to the text of the Seder Hamaracha, but very few of them have Aleinu L'Shabeach, and the ones that do show it as a very separate part. So in his view, this is debunking. In his research, he managed to disprove what Professor Tashima had asserted, and he's saying that no, Aleinu is not the end of the Seder HaMaracha. It has no relation to the Seder HaMaracha. It remains a mystery as to why Aleinu L'Shabeach was chosen to be a part of the tefillah in early Ashkenaz. We know it was. In early Sarad, no, it was not. But in early Ashkenaz and Sarfat, it became a part and parcel of the end of tefillah. And as we'll see next week, perhaps it was because they lived in a Christian environment and they wanted to say a prayer that was anti-Christian. Whatever the reasons are, we'll discuss this next week. But essentially, the Seder HaMaracha seems to have nothing to do with Aleinu L'Shabeach. And it's fascinating. If anyone's interested, you could, of course, look at the history by Tashima and the history by Ophir Manor. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I'm sorry. But if you look at the time of by the time of the Siddur HaYavitz, the Yavitz, the Rav Yaakov Emden, by his time, the Seder HaMaamadot in the Siddurim became extremely corrupt. Like, he didn't even know who wrote it. The Sefer HaEshkol attributes it to Rabbi Zakein, and all the manuscripts attributed to Rabbi Zakein. But because they changed the name to Seder HaMaamadot, and because so few of the printed Siddurim actually attributed it, it began to get so corrupted that it no longer even had the section of Maaseh Bereshit. So what Rav Yaakov Emden saw from all of his Siddurim that he was looking at was a complete mess. He's like, I don't know who wrote this. I don't know what the structure is. I don't know what they're trying to do. He really was very not impressed with this whole section that's called Seder HaMaamadot at the end of davening. So Rav Yaakov Emden is very critical of it. He doesn't really recommend saying it, but because it's always been a part of the printed Siddurim, he develops his own version, which I believe includes the Seder Maaseh Bereshit, and he puts it at the end of his Seder Shachrit. So the Seder HaMaamadot, the Seder HaMaracha really is a very interesting addition to the end of Shachrit, and it has its own. I mean, studying it would be both the medieval history and the modern history is almost out of scope, because we could totally. It's very boring, honestly, but we could totally spend an hour talking about all the manuscripts of it and all the and how it evolved and which manuscripts had what parts, and which ones contained Hazinu, which ones contained Shir Shal Yom, which ones contained the Korbanot, which ones didn't contain the Korbanot. Like, we could discuss all of that ad nauseum, but I believe that's a little bit out of scope, and nobody yet has actually studied how it developed in the modern era precisely. Regardless, Aleinu L'Shabeach is probably not from the Seder HaMaracha. That's probably not its early provenance. And next week we will have to discuss and we will have to think about why Aleinu L'Shabeach became a part of the tefillah in early Ashkenaz and why it became a part of our prayer Ad Yom Hazeh. So to recap what we learned tonight, we learned that in the time of the first and second Beit HaMikdash, there was a Seder HaMaamadot of the Mishmarim, of the Mishmarot, right? And there were various prayers and liturgies said in that era. We saw a suggestion from Rav Yosef Heinemann that Aleinu L'Shabeach was originally written then. We also saw a suggestion the idea from Sunz and Elbogen that Aleinu was written by the school of Rav, Tkiyata Debei Rav. We saw the suggestion from Meir Bar Ilan that it was written in the time by the Tanaim and the Sifrei Hechalot, and from the Hechalot it went to the Rosh Hashanah davening. We saw the argument on him that no, really it began in the Rosh Hashanah davening and in turn was put into the Hechalot, right? We saw that from those who argue on him. They think it's an anti-Binitarian prayer. And we saw the attribution by Yisrael Tashema that perhaps it was written. We saw Kaufman that it's maybe pre-Christian, and we saw the Tashema that says perhaps it was from the Seder Hamaracha from Rabbi Leo Hazaken. Not that it was written by Rabbi Leo Hazaken. I'm sorry, but it got into our tefillah beginning with Rabbi Leo Hazaken. Regardless, this Aleinu is representative of a corpus of liturgy, which has always been known to be optional, which has always been understood to be not a part of the statutory prayer, but its development and its attachment to our Tefillat Shachrit will teach us, Be'ezrat Hashem, next week, a lot about how medieval prayer developed. Today, we discussed how it relates to ancient prayer and how difficult it is to discuss and how difficult it is to know and understand ancient prayer. But next week, we will discuss, Be'ezrat Hashem, how Aleinu Shabbat is difficult to understand even as a medieval prayer. So thank you to everybody for your time and attention. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we will continue next week.